Welcome to the MBA Series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show. All right, everyone, welcome to the MBA series. This is episode 7, which is on enterprise structures and legal frameworks. If you've been listening, some of the pieces we went over recently in this MBA series is implementing the principles of Next Economy enterprises. So we went through the 10 principles, and now we're turning to some of the enterprise structures and legal frameworks because principles alone are not enough to help us transition to the next economy, because the business as usual economy has operating structures and legal systems that favor the status quo and suppress change. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how people have been working on building new structures and hacking old structures in order to change their operating systems. So we'll talk about what structures are available and which ones will allow you and your organization to best express next economy principles. I'm joined by my business partner, Kevin Bayuk. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. Happy to be here.
How would you kick this section off? Let's frame up this discussion. What should people be thinking about in terms of legal frameworks and enterprise structures?
I like the way you said that when we have this intention to transition from the business as usual economy to the next economy, you may recall that we had that framework from the Berkana Institute of kind of hospicing out the dying system that is being composted or transformed and midwifing in the new. And it can be really frustrating for people who want to do next economy activities and organize for providing for their communities with needed goods and services, where they're like, if I have to conform to the business as usual, if I have to form a corporation or an LLC, or if I have to conform to the statutes of the business as usual economy, I'm constrained in terms of how there might be hard limits as to how much I can actually express the next economy principles. And so there's this anxious energy of looking for solutions about how do we do this. So one of the first things that we usually share is to really start to question, do you need an organization at all? A structure, I should say. So there's a lot of next economy activities that we can maybe implement in our own lives and our families and our communities that don't require any paperwork filing or adherence to statutes. So we can start, I'll use small examples, not to be cliche about it, because actually they're powerful in aggregate, but clothing swaps and gift circles and tondas and potlucks and just contributing volunteerism in our community. There's lots of things we could do that require mutual aid networks that are self-organized and maybe don't even need a bank account, or, in terms of interfacing with the business as usual economy structures. There's lots of informal economic activities which are absolutely in alignment with midwifing in an economy that works for the benefit of all life and meeting the needs of our communities without having to file articles of incorporation or draft up a bylaws or authorize and issue shares of stock or sell units of some kind of LLC legal entity. And so that's the first thing, is just take a pause and say, do we even need a formal structure? And in some cases you do. A lot of activities that we would say are in this transition kind of middle ground like, yeah, we have a group of people. We're going to be producing some goods for the community. And we'd like to have a bank account. We'd like to include our community members in ownership so that if we do create any surplus or benefits, that it could be distributed back to those very same community members. And good news is there are mechanisms that exist. And one of the reasons we have the book and the training and the MBA is those mechanisms that exist are not the ones that you'll find oftentimes disclosed readily at the Small Business Administration documentation or your local business consulting or your local community college, or certainly not your university MBA program, institutional learning around business. The business as usual norms that are oftentimes presented are kind of offered as is, like, here's the tools that you have to run any type of enterprise. And that's not the case. Like, you use the word hack in the intro and the preamble. We can actually hack some of those existing structures, and there are some emergent possibilities that are fairly novel and I think make it easier to express a number of the next economy principles in your operations. Does that make sense as a place to kind of start from, is this question, do we need a structure at all?
Yeah. And all the angst that goes into getting the right one, quote unquote.
And I think that's another piece too, is we meet, obviously, some of our core work at Lift Economy, we meet with social enterprises or individuals wanting to start a communitarian endeavor. And they're like, okay, I read about this thing. I want to start a multi-stakeholder cooperative in Colorado or in Georgia or whatever it is. And there's kind of an attachment to a structure or an entity type. And one of the key takeaways from a lot of our training is, whereas this choice of entity type is a very strategic and important decision, that the vision and outcomes, the impact vision for what you're trying to achieve, should be in the driver's seat, should be the thing that dictates your choices rather than the other way around. So there can be kind of an infatuation and attachment with certain emergent structures, which is fine, but we've seen an overcorrection. Won't name names, but tens of thousands of dollars of legal costs and years of development of governance, covenants, and structures for an organization that turns out wasn't really financially feasible due either to capital constraints or a couple other reasons. That would be the classic example of like an overcorrection. They really had great ideas of a beautiful, elegant legal structure that an entity formation process is beautiful, but we advocate for testing ideas, making sure we're meeting community needs, finding the lean way to make sure that there's a reciprocity model that's going to work. And when you have confidence around that, then choicefully right-size your investment in finding the structure that's going to allow you to most elegantly express as much of the next economy principles, as many of the next economy principles as you can.
Yeah. And so where would you take folks given that? Do you dive straight into, all right, let's talk about C Corps and S Corps or LLCs, or do you take folks somewhere else?
Well, I think pursuant to that kind of thing of being overly attached to a particular structure up front and then maybe over-indexing or over-investing and getting something perfect that's novel and emergent. Again, we love that discourse and those conversations, and we want to swim in those waters and find the right structures to utilize that are coming around. But this, you use the word hack again, this adaptation of finding even within the existing structures that the business as usual economy offers as possible. There's a lot that can be done. And one way to think about it is the distinction between a legal structure, a legal entity, a corporation, a partnership, an LLC, a legal entity, and an operating structure. So a legal structure versus an operating structure. And what we mean by that is, a classic example to like ground this would be a nonprofit corporation. So in the United States, a corporation is incorporated in a state. So you and I, Ryan, today are in the state of California. So if we incorporated a nonprofit corporation, we would incorporate it in the state of California. as a for public benefit corporation. And then further, if we wanted to pursue tax deductible status, we would have to apply to both the state of California and the IRS, file some forms with both of those entities and say, hey, we are organized for a charitable purpose. We'd like to have be able to provide a tax deduction to people who provide us with qualified gifts or philanthropic or grants to do the work that we want to do. And then the IRS in the state of California would judge whether or not they agree that we have a charitable purpose. For the IRS, the most common form would they say, okay, you're a nonprofit, here's your 501c3 status, as an example. So many people listening here have heard of the 501c3 status to be a charitable nonprofit organization. And when we look at the state of California, back when you incorporated the for public benefit corporation, state of California and other states have statutes as to what does it mean to be a corporation in California. Even if it's a nonprofit corporation, you have to have a board of directors. There's certain requirements that actually imply or confer power and governance rights to the board, and depending on what's written in your documents, to the officers. And so the state mandates certain things. So if you have a group of people and say, but we want to operate in a way that's more collective and communitarian, we want to share power, because that is more, we have a next economy principle of equitable and democratic governance, right? So we don't want to concentrate power into a board of directors to be able to set compensation, set the strategy of the organization, create the budgets, approve things. We want to operate in a way that's more collective and exercise our dialogue and deliberation practices to distribute power. Well, there's the Sustainable Economies Law Center, the CELC, THESELC.org, has done some pathfinding on what they call worker self-directed nonprofits, which I don't know if they would characterize it this way, but I would say it's a great hack, like you used the word hack, a great hack on the nonprofit structure, where they have a whole working group, and through a number of mechanisms, whether it's how the bylaws are written, different clauses that could be inserted there, different policies that could be developed around decision making. They have a whole suite of strategies that a nonprofit could use to, what I would say, is operate much more like a cooperative, or operate much more decentralized in terms of power decentralization rather than power concentration, to be, as they say, a worker self-directed nonprofit within the confines of a legal system, a legal entity structure that the state has statutes that dictate what is allowable or not. And so that's a distinction, operating structure versus legal structure, that could apply not just to nonprofits in the example of worker self-directed nonprofits, but to a lot of organizations. For example, a lot of worker-owned cooperatives or worker-managed cooperatives. There are a number of states that have statutes, cooperative statutes, where you can incorporate as a cooperative corporation in the state. There are a number of states that don't, or have very constrained cooperative statutes. And so in certain states, you'll find groups of people who want to operate as a cooperative actually incorporate as an LLC. So they're choosing a business as usual, if you will, complying and conforming with those statutes. But then in the way in which they operate more like a cooperative, or practice self-management or decentralized decision-making, decentralized power. You could critique those hacks because you might say, well, when it comes down to certain key decisions, or somebody makes a claim, or if there's a legal claim, it kind of goes back to the state, and the state will say you have to apply the statutes according to how your legal documents are written to manage this conflict or manage this final decision. And I think that's a healthy critique in some cases. There are some limits to how far we can hack these structures to be perfect. And in some ways, you could say that all of the business as usual structures that we might use for next economy endeavors have durability challenges. How durable is our choice of structure and how we design it to be able to express our next economy principles or to have the impact we want to have. And there's a series of advantages or disadvantages to each of the structures in terms of durability of mission or purpose or impact. Different words are used, but how durable, how reliable is the structure? And we could talk through in the training, of course, and in the book, we examine some of those trade-offs while also with the backdrop of framing what are those structures like, because we're all starting at different points in our journey. There's a number of direct action activists and people who are doing incredible work to transform their communities who probably thankfully haven't actually gone through business training to know the difference between a partnership and an LLC and a corporation and the trade-offs of the different types of forms. And so there's a general literacy that I think is really useful to be able to communicate about these things. So if you do talk to a lawyer or you do talk to a CPA and you want to know about the tax implications of a structure, that you have some basis to be able to compare and contrast. So there's some of that information both in the training and the book. But most of the emphasis on when we compare structures, we look at which ones can have more inclusive ownership, which ones can have more democratic governance built into it, which ones can have a more durable preservation of the intent of a team to create impact or benefit or have a purpose that serves life. Those are the things that we talk about the most. And I think in a moment we can talk about some of the highlights there.
Yeah, maybe we should do some highlights because, as you said, it's a lot of detail and we go into it in depth in the course and in the book. But what do you see most often for folks who make the choice? Like, what are the common choice points, even though it does vary from company to company?
That's a good question. I think, well, let me go through a little bit more of like one of the more common traps or whatever that we see. I'll just name one that start with that and then move on to what are the ones that we see that essentially enable the best expressions of next economy principles. And for anybody listening from outside the United States, obviously there are this particular conversation in this portion of the book and the portion of the Next Economy MBA training that we're discussing right now is fairly US centric. There's good analogous structures in other nation states, other countries that we could talk about a little bit, but we'll be using a lot of terminology that's very United States centric. But the one trap that I wanted to mention in particular was, for many people who are less familiar with some of the nuance here, is there's an assumption that corporation bad, nonprofit good. Just the way I like oversimplify it or the caricature. And I'm sure there's some wisdom to that observation that there's a particular psychopathy to corporate endeavors that is easily recognizable in the world, especially multinational corporations and publicly traded public equity corporations that have created an enormity of harm and have externalized social and environmental damage that's hard to enumerate and measure. And the idea is like, well, profit must be the driver that is causing these corporations to do so much harm. And so nonprofit seems like the antidote in some way. So you take away the profit incentive, then a nonprofit must be doing good. And I think one insight that we've learned over time is that nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that its operations and what it is doing is going to be conducive to the conditions that create life. They're not going to be necessarily beneficial to all life. Not that they're bad per se, but bad, good, those kind of subjective terms don't quite capture all the nuance. But I think it was until recently, and I don't know the exact years, but the National Football League, who is ever listening might have an opinion about the National Football League, the NFL. My understanding was that it was a nonprofit corporation for most of its existence. I don't think it is today. Or, again, people might have different political persuasions or ideas about this, but the National Rifle Association has, I don't know the status at this moment. I remember there was some controversy about it.
I think they're all 501c4s.
They're C4. So, but still a charitable organization.
But still a nonprofit.
Yeah, still a nonprofit.
The one that we got in our book that Steve Dubb gave us was there are 501c3s that are sort of like women's education resource centers that are sort of you go to if you're maybe pregnant and wanting to potentially seek counsel on an abortion, but they're not really designed to like help you make that choice. It's sort of very religious
Upfront.
and like sort of like yeah. So, and those are 501c3s.
Sure.
Yeah.
And certainly there's terrific stories or terrible stories of charitable foundations with a charitable status, private foundations that famously have created harm of different types. So that's a great example. So I think it's easy to critique that when we talk about how can we unleash the flourishing of a next economy that works for the benefit of all life, nonprofit is too simple of an answer. It's like, okay, I need to start a nonprofit to do work that's of benefit. Doesn't mean that nonprofit is a bad structure choice for expression of next economy principles per se, but I think it's healthy to at least question whether or not a nonprofit is the right choice inherently to do good or to be of benefit. So with that said, I would say that nonprofits are one of the structures that tends to show up a lot with the participants of the Next Economy MBA and people that we work with. We work with a lot of nonprofits, especially when the nonprofit is a affiliated entity with other organizations. One of the drawbacks of nonprofits in the United States is that oftentimes, not always for certain, but many nonprofits find that in order to do their work that they want to do, that's say good work or charitable work, they need to find philanthropic gift or support, which in many cases for the large foundations that they might seek or solicit support from, there's something strange, almost energetically about it, where a lot of those foundations were created from the largesse of the exploitation economy. So you have the business as usual economy, exploiting people and planet, creating these massive wealth concentrations, which get put into charitable foundation structures to avoid certain taxation. And then these foundations invest those charitable assets in the market economy, the business as usual economy, to perpetuate cycles of harm, and then use maybe a minimum, the 5% minimum requirement by the IRS for a private foundation to give every year.
It's like the Sacklers, right? Famously from OxyContin money.
Right.
And then
we'll make.
But then they give to the New York Museum. It says like the Sackler family.
Right.
And so it's like sort of philanthropy washing.
Right. And there's charitable activity. And I think Anand Giridharadas and others have done a terrific job of critiquing that kind of notion that create the largesse through the business as usual economy and then create change and transformation through private philanthropy. There's a very healthy critique out there. But I think the energetic piece I was talking about is when you have these nonprofits who are trying to do good work, and they sometimes, not always at all, not always, but they sometimes become dependent upon these legacy institutions in order to sustain their operation. And so that dependency is the thing that feels energetically strange or awkward, not to mention that something like the nonprofits we've worked with, up to 30 to 40% of the person hours and budget of the organization could be used in development or basically in the pursuit of getting grants and gifts. So huge amount of entropic energy, just heat is generated from, wow, we were dependent upon this money and now we need to go get it. And so only a certain amount of work is able to be done. And some people refer to this whole thing as the nonprofit industrial complex, amongst other aspects of it. And that dependency, now, just as a quick anecdote, there's a number of nonprofits out there that are supported by small gifts from their community, from a large number of community members, not at all taking money from large foundations. And that's kind of a different thing. So just want to highlight that a nonprofit absolutely could, or some blend of the two.
Or state government funding.
Municipal or state funding.
Yeah.
Exactly. Great point.
Yeah.
So there are nonprofits that are where it feels more energetically aligned. So there's that piece. But to name nonprofits as one example, we do see nonprofits that either wholly own or even partially own other entities. And so I think a lot of people don't know that a nonprofit could be the owner. And so one example, when we talk about like banking as just an example from business as usual economy, definitely we could look at some structures like, well, how would we transform banking? And the full transformation of banking is a big story, but even the hospice, incremental, less bad transformation of banking, we could look towards a couple different structures, and some that we point out as examples would be, of course, cooperative credit unions, member-owned, member-controlled credit unions is a structure, again, that's available to us. But we could also look at nonprofit-owned banks, sometimes even charitable foundation-owned banks, a beneficial state bank as an example, a bank that's chartered to generate profits for shareholders. Some of the large banks obviously have even been sanctioned by the regulatory authority to the extent that it has any power to regulate banks because of their predatory behavior. But in the case of beneficial state bank, as an example, because a nonprofit owns it, the nonprofit that's chartered for public benefit, any surplus that the bank accrues flows through the nonprofit to the benefit of the community. Is that a perfect structure? Not a perfect necessarily expression of all aspects of the Next Economy principles. Is it better than the business as usual corporate shareholder owned banks? Absolutely. Like without a doubt, it's better. It's just an example. But it doesn't have to be banks. We could have been talking about any number of organizations. In the book, I think we use the case story of Homeboy Industries as a nonprofit in Southern California that has created a whole mosaic of enterprises that generate earned income. So nonprofit, sometimes you think of, has to get its sustenance from gift and philanthropy. That's not at all true. Homeboy Industries, I believe, has a bakery, they have a cafe, farmers markets, they do electronics recycling, I think a catering company, and also like partially vertically integrated. It's an excellent economic model for providing livelihood. In the case of Homeboy Industries, that they've been, the primary goal of the nonprofit is to help former gang members kind of redirect their lives and energy to become beneficial contributing members to their community. And they have built these enterprises through job training and program work, and then are able to provide needed goods and services to their community. And they also kind of open source their model to replicate it across the country or across the world, which, they're providing case management, mental health services, education, in addition to other personal growth and development practices. So they're providing benefit to the community in a nonprofit structure, but using enterprises within the nonprofit. And there's a number of clients that we worked with at Lift Economy where there's a nonprofit that is actually an owner, either a part owner or a whole owner of organizations, including co-ops. So just in these affiliations, an example, the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, there's a nonprofit institution that is, I believe, a 20% owner, a part owner of worker-owned cooperatives. So it's a network of a couple or now a few worker-owned cooperatives with a shared governance model. So there's some power that the nonprofit has in certain decision making, but of course the workers having rights and not only distribution of the benefits, but also governance rights in the organization. And so there's this sharing across entities. And this kind of hybrid affiliated entity type structures are, I guess what I'd say is they're not taught or shared as far as we know very much in business as usual, small business advisory or in MBA, institutional MBA textbooks or that type of thing. So that's those are a couple of examples, but there's a bunch of others that I would love to touch on as well. Actually, Ryan, one thing that'd be interesting is I mentioned Beneficial State Bank. They're also a certified B Corp. Am I right about that? And maybe you could make the distinction of like what's certified B Corp,
Yep.
beneficial corporation. And this is another thing that gets people tripped up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important for folks just a little history as to why there's something called a B Corp and a Benefit Corp, because it can be confusing. So in 2000 and I think it was 2005, the founders of B Lab, which are the nonprofit behind the B Corp movement, were trying to sell their company, which was a sports apparel company, before B Lab. And the way that U.S. corporate law is set up, some would argue it's not a legal responsibility. Some would argue it's more of a cultural expectation. But whether it's legal or a cultural expectation, there's a pressure to maximize shareholder value, profits on a liquidity event or a sale. I'm using a lot of jargon here, but when you sell your company, usually you have to sell to the highest bidder. And what happened is that this basketball company that they had built, they had to sell it to a private equity firm that stripped out all the social and environmental benefits that they had built in over the years. This was really depressing for the founders of B Lab. And so they spoke to many mission-driven companies and entrepreneurs in the impact space and said, what if we could build a new type of thing, which they called a B corporation, which would have two key components built into it. So the first component of this new type of company is a certification or an assessment that looks at every aspect of a company. So workers, governance, community, environment, customers. And the idea was to say, it's great if you're organic certified milk, but how do you pay your employees, even if you're like organically certified? So there's some certifications which are great, but they don't tell the whole story. And so B Lab really said, first, let's have an assessment that can look at every aspect of a company. The second thing they built into that model is a legal requirement that said, in addition to profits, this company will also consider workers, community, and the environment when making decisions. And what that did is in the corporate charter of a company, you could take on investors or potentially grow your company and potentially sell your company to others and not have to maximize shareholder value at every decision point that involved money or potentially selling the company. And so the reason there's two is because it used to just be one thing called the B Corporation that had a legal component and a certification component. What they had to do in the United States is, this is a little wonky, but the US law is at the state level. And so each state had to pass its own benefit corporation law. And I think there's 38 laws in the 50 states. And so, in South Carolina, California, Delaware, New York, you can become a benefit corporation, which basically is similar to a standard corporation, but it has the added requirement that a company has to consider more than just profits when making decisions. So it's a voluntary legal structure that entrepreneurs who are mission driven want to adopt in order to protect their mission. And then there's also a certification called B Corp certification, which I think there's like 5,800 certified B Corps around the globe that have done that. And incidentally, there's actually more benefit corporations. There's like triple the amount of benefit corporations. Because a lot of companies are wanting that legal protection, but they haven't yet pursued the certification for whatever reason. And so maybe that's, I don't know, Kevin, does that sort of help with the distinction between the two?
Yeah, it does. And so in the case of Beneficial State Bank, which entity is certified?
Yeah. So they are both.
Uh-huh.
So Beneficial State Bank is a benefit corporation legally, and then they're also a certified B corporation.
But wholly owned by a foundation, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so
that's right. Yeah.
So this is that hybrid kind of thing. You have a charitable foundation that owns a benefit corporation, which is also a certified B Corp. And so these things can play off each other. And the intent of all these different structures is to bind the intent for benefit to life in a more and more durable ways. And in a moment, I'll talk about some of the other ways. Well, I'll mention right now some of the other ways we see the whole world of cooperatives. Lyft Economy is a California benefit corporation that operates as a worker-owned cooperative because we have, for every worker owner, there's a governance share, so it's one worker, one vote. So it's kind of conforming to the worker-owned cooperative principles of a worker-owned cooperative, but we practice a democracy in our governance by having one worker, one vote, even if legally we are a benefit corporation. But there's multiple types of cooperatives that we go through in the book. We talk about worker-owned cooperatives. We talk about consumer cooperatives. We talk about producer cooperative, a consumer cooperative that many people are familiar with, an organization like REI, the recreation kind of outdoor wear and hardware company, is a consumer cooperative. But there's a number of, there's a number of food cooperatives, Park Slope Food Cooperative in Brooklyn, New York, and a lot of schools, preschools, nursery schools are organized as essentially consumer cooperatives. There's producer cooperatives, famous ones that people might know about in the United States would be like Organic Valley is an example of a producer cooperative that does kind of shared marketing and maybe some shared assets for developing their supply web, in this case of dairy products. But there's also, an emergent group of multi-stakeholder cooperatives. An example of a multi-stakeholder cooperative would be like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, which Lift Economy helped develop and get going with through the Force for Good Fund, which one of the investees of the Force for Good Fund is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And it's a multi-stakeholder cooperative in that you have residents in permanently affordable housing who are owners and have governance right in the organization. You have workers who are helping organize the acquisition of property and the redevelopment of property for permanent affordability. Those workers are also involved in the governance and have rights. And then you have community members who can invest in the multi-stakeholder cooperative in small amounts, which in aggregate enable the purchasing of these housing assets to be put into permanent affordability structures. And those community members those community investors are also a stakeholder, a member. And so you have multiple stakeholders who are members. And this, again, binds some of the intent and enables an expression of democratic governance, more inclusive ownership, more inclusive sharing of benefits. And therefore, because of the shared governance, you get better opportunity to see some of the other principles expressed, like decisions that emphasize personal growth and development, or the principle of contributing to systems change, principles around transparency. The decisions that would drive those types of expressions of principles require people being aligned in the sharing governance. And if we allow for capital or investors, for example, to control the governance, oftentimes the default business as usual operation is to be opaque and not be transparent, is to sacrifice investments in personal growth and development in favor of margin and profit, or to moreover not to contribute to systems change work, but actually to reify the existing exploitation systems by lobbying and things that favor a regulatory environment that favors more profits. So just to name a few of the principles, so these different structures. So cooperatives are definitely featured both in the book and in our training, and a lot of the participants in the Next Economy MBA, as well as people who are working in the Next Economy, definitely see cooperatives as a structure that exists. Again, I mentioned earlier that certain states have cooperative statutes, and again, you might be able to use the LLC structure as a business as usual, entity form, and actually operate as a democratic organization, operate in a way that is like a cooperative without actually incorporating as a cooperative. One more that's emergent that I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, because something we're very excited about seeing happen more and more, is the whole set of what we call like steward-owned organizations, steward ownership models, which cooperatives could fit into that. The idea of steward ownership, as championed by the Purpose Foundation and some of their work, they kind of examined organizations around the world that had this durability.
Recent interview with Derek on the podcast.
Sure, maybe we can link that one. That we go into way more detail there. Thanks, Ryan, for reminding me so I can keep this short. But steward ownership, one of the more novel mechanisms that I think has emerged that a lot of people don't know about, and we haven't yet seen being taught in any institutional, business environment, is this idea of having a trust, or either an employee-owned trust or a perpetual purpose trust. The idea of a purpose trust structure, the trusts as a structure have been around for a while, used for different purposes, for different means, for different outcomes. But a trust can be, a trust basically has, like a trustees, a trust protector, and beneficiaries. Well, the beneficiaries of a trust could be the enumerated purposes of the beneficial impact and intent that the founders, the group that has started an organization with next economy principles in mind, the types of outcomes that they want to see in the world. They might be able to enumerate a set of ideals and principles or actions that are expressions of the purpose of why they created the organization. And the trust is able to enshrine those purposes essentially in perpetuity and assign governance council or governance committee of trustees to help manage that in perpetuity. And it's, again, gets at this durability, this reliability of impact. And so we're very excited for certain organizations of a certain size and stage who are endeavoring to enshrine and bind their intent into these types of trust structures to share benefits, to decentralize power, and to create durable, beneficial impacts to life over a long period of time.
Excellent. So as we look to wrap, what are some closing thoughts for folks who are sort of grappling with this piece? Like, what would you recommend for next steps? Like, how could folks apply some of this to maybe a situation they might be in now?
Really depends on what situation you're in. I think what we tried to do in the book, maybe I'll put that as kind of one action. What we tried to do in the book is present enough literacy about what's out there and what's possible, because knowing your options, I think, is the main thing that's missing. We meet so many people. It was like, I started a Delaware corporation, and I've never even been to Delaware, and I don't know why. And I was told I was supposed to create stock options for employees, so I did that, and authorized 10 million shares, and I don't know why it was 10 million. And so they kind of fell into whatever was normal from the advisory, the legal counsel or CPA that they talked to, who helped them start an organization, and they feel stuck in terms of now I can't do all the things that I want to do in terms of the impacts I want to create. And so knowing what's out there, knowing the options, just even if it's a superficial understanding, there's been a lot of jargon that Ryan and I have talked about. There's a lot to understand, but you don't necessarily have to be an expert in any of these things. There are supportive allies, cooperators are standing by, as Carolyn Casey would say. That I mentioned the Sustainable Economies Law Center as an example of a group that provides great guidance, and there's other legal counsel that Lift Economy has worked with in a number of other situations that maybe we could link to, or we're happy to provide introductions as needed. But knowing your options before you go into the depth of the decision-making of choosing a legal structure is important. And to know that you can choose one of these default business as usual legal structures and operate in ways, the hack that Ryan said, you can operate in ways that that align more with your values. You can switch, you can change, it's not impossible. The further you go, especially after maybe taking investors, taking on capital, it becomes harder and harder or more expensive to switch structures. So there's a kind of a right timing to it. But knowing what's out there, knowing that even if you have a default structure, you can operate in many ways more in alignment with your values without having to change your legal structure. I think those are the main takeaways that we usually talk about when wading through this, how do we transition from the business as usual to the next economy?
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. And hopefully, listeners, you got something out of this. And as a heads up, next time on the MBA series, we'll be talking about personal strategies and life design. So we can build the sort of structures, but we also have to change ourselves. And so what are the habits and behaviors and norms that need to change for us individually? So until next time, we look forward to seeing you again.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.